All right. Um, Hi, everyone. I live in Oberlin, Ohio, and I'm going to tell you about Lynds Jones, who was one of the first ornithologists in the United States, and he was actually the first person to teach ornithology as an academic subject. But he's been largely forgotten by modern birders. Ornithologists still know who he is. But he was responsible for a lot of the practices that we take for granted as standard in recreational birding, which is not what he set out to do. But as an ornithologist, he ended up doing a lot of things that now we do recreationally, like the Christmas bird count, which is also ornithology, but it's the longest running citizen science project. Um, He actually started that 3 years before um, the Audubon Society got it going in 1900. I'm going to tell you about that. I'm also going to tell you about his first big day and how he encouraged other people to take that. Or he did the Christmas bird count and encourage other people to do that as a way to alleviate the boredom of winter birding. Um, he did the first big day of over 100 species in Lorain County, Ohio. Um, And he founded an ornithological journal and ornithology society, the Wilson Ornithological Society, that's still active today, and they still publish a journal. Uh, the reason I got started in it became interested in Lynds Jones was because uh, Ken Kaufman posted this meme on Facebook in 2018, and it said Lynds Jones and W.L. Dawson started. They made his birding history 120 years ago today, did the first big day of over 100 species. 100 species. Sorry. I'm not used to doing Zoom talks with no audience feedback. Um, and
So
they started in
super
Oberlin.
excited. Doing great.
Okay. They started in Oberlin and did their big day in Lorain County. And I was surprised. I'd never heard of these people. I'd lived in Oberlin now for 21 years. At that point, it was 15 years. And so I got curious. I was like, well, I need to read a book about Lynds Jones and or Will Dawson. But I Googled them and there's no book. So I'm a writer and I thought, well, I'll write a book. Haven't written the book yet, but I have spent a lot of hours in the archives at Oberlin College digging up information. And the more I look into this family, the more rabbit holes I dive into. So I'm going to share a few of them with you. He left an important legacy to ornithology. Like, as I said, he taught the first collegiate course. He founded the Wilson Ornithological Society and its journal, and he co-wrote The Birds of Ohio in 1903. As a recreational birding, that wasn't a practice in the 19th century. And he was perhaps the first um, lister. He kept a life list and a sort of akin to what we would call eBird, except it wasn't electronic. He kept lists of birds that he saw wherever he went. He also left an important legacy to ecology. He was one of the pioneers in the field. And not only did he teach the first course in ornithology, but he had a first in the country Department of Ecology and led some really fascinating field trips to the West Coast that I am going to tell you about. Start with ornithology. He was born in Ashtabula, Ohio in 1865. Um, and his father was a captain in the militia, but didn't fight in the Civil War. So rather than face his comrades coming back from the war, he moved his family to Iowa later that year. And so that's where Lines grew up. His father was a farmer, but apparently um, not very good at making money. So his kids uh, did odd jobs around the town to make money. And a neighbor taught Lines how to collect bird eggs, which at that time you could sell and sell for money. So he got very interested in this as not just a hobby, but sort of a profession, as a 9-year-old. By the age of 25, he had collected or traded for eggs of 250 bird species. And I think that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. I consider it an honor when I find a nest anywhere that has eggs in it. And he knew where the nests of an incredible number of birds were. This is an alder flycatcher clutch that he collected in Lorain County, Ohio, which is where I am. They don't breed here anymore. In 1886, he and some neighbors founded a chapter of a national natural history association. It's called the Agassiz Association. It was geographically distributed. It was kind of like a scouts to get mostly young people interested in the study of natural history. It was named after Louis Agassiz, who had some now what we consider controversial views on race. And he also was a major opponent of Darwin. He believed that God created the world, that there was not evolution. And so his philosophy was through the study of nature, we get closer to God. But it inspired young people to study nature. And Lynds was a collector, as I said, of eggs. The other kids collected other objects and they formed a little museum. And they had this tabloid newspaper that I found in the archives. It's like big size, handwritten. I don't know how many copies they made. There's only one in the archives, and this is volume one, number 5. I think it's the earliest one that I could find from October of 1886, and that have pages and pages of handwritten articles about little tidbits about natural history. And Lyons was especially interested in bird migration. He they took turns being editors, and this is the first issue that I could find where he was listed as managing editor, and then he edited a journal for basically the rest of his life. The Agassiz Association also had state conferences, and so the students from Grinnell would go to the state conference and present their papers. They published in a journal, the Swiss Cross. Um, and in 1888, a group of ornithologists, or a group of people who interested in studying birds, I should say, or collecting eggs, decided that they would form a chapter that wasn't geographically based, but more interest based. And they started this corresponding chapter where they wrote to each other and they published in this journal. Initially, it was Ornithologists and Oologists Semi-Annual, became the Wilson Bulletin, and then the Wilson Journal of Ornithology in 2005. It's still published today. Here's an example of the inside of the journal from April 1891. They had 15 members. They elected Lynds Jones president by 9 votes, but he was also the secretary who tallied the votes and the acting treasurer. And he wrote the editorial as the incoming editor, and he was the editor of the journal. All in all, he was secretary for the first year, editor of the journal for 36 years, and he also served as president and treasurer, some of these concurrently. How he came to Oberlin. When he was a young man, he studied at Grinnell College in the town that he lived in, but Grinnell had a very classically oriented curriculum. His aunt happened to be married to the then treasurer of Oberlin College, and she wrote to him and said, I think you should come and study at Oberlin because we have a lot more classes based in natural history, and I know that of your interest, and I would help sponsor you to come to Oberlin. which he then did. Took the train to Oberlin, studied for 2 years, and was hired as the curator of the college's Museum of Natural History, and married one of his fellow Agassiz Association members from Iowa and brought her to Oberlin, Clara Tallman. In 1892, he said to the college, "Hey, I'd really like to teach a class on birds, and I know a lot about the subject. What do you say?" And the college said, I don't know. Doesn't sound like it would be that interesting, but we'll allow you to collect a laboratory fee and you can teach it as a lab class on top of being curator of the museum. It became so popular that they added it to the curriculum in 1895, and he had as many as 150 students, and they would have labs in groups. Every morning, they would go out on foot, and on Saturday, he would take the advanced students for an all-day trip. One of his biggest collaborators um, for most of his life was this man, William Leon Dawson, who I believe went by Leon. He was originally a student of Lynds's. He graduated in 1897 from Oberlin College, studied theology. He became a pastor and took a job out in Washington State. And he was heavily influenced in his career by Lynds Jones and eventually gave up being a minister and full-time became an ornithologist. He was a huge egg collector, just like Lynds, and the eggs that he collected, he eventually donated to a museum that he founded, the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And he and Lynds co-wrote The Birds of Ohio, but he also wrote Birds of Washington and Birds of California in 2 volumes. They took an epic trip in the summer of 1900. Took a trip to the west by train. Lynds by that time had family living in Pasadena, so he went to Pasadena while Leon went north to Washington State. They reunited and crossed Lake Chelan in Washington by steamboat, hiked in the mountains, um, keeping notes of all the birds that they saw, collecting specimens, and generally having an amazing time until they had a fire that it wasn't completely put out when after breakfast, they set off for their daily hike and came back and found that most of their remaining belongings had burned. And the arsenic that they were using to preserve the bird skins poisoned their food. So they were literally up a creek without a paddle. And they built a homemade raft, floated down the Skagit River, eventually made it back to society. And when they told people what they had done and where they had been, nobody believed that it was true. Um, in all, they traveled 7,000 miles, saw 309 species, 14 states, and they published their adventures in the Wilson Bulletin. I recently came across this notebook. The current professor of ornithology found it in a closet in the biology building. This is Lynds' journal from that trip, the 1900 Western trip. And this is one of the pages where he wrote the birds that he had seen on particular days. And it's one of these days, I'm not sure which one, where they had the fire disaster, but you can see he had his notebook with him. So that survived. The Birds of Ohio is a massive tome. It's not meant to be a field guide. It's 671 pages in 2 volumes. Dawson was revising it in 1928 when he came down with pneumonia and died, unfortunately, in Columbus, Ohio. I just want to share with you some of the writing, the whole entire book is like this. It's worth looking it up, and you can find it by Googling it online. Excuse me. The Bobolink. Without waiting for their more modest mates, the males press northward, hot-winged, to riot for a while over the dank meadows in bachelor companies and to perfect that marvel of tumultuous song. I'm sure if you've ever heard a bobolink sing, you know what I'm talking about. They sound like R2-D2, and they're loud and they sing across the fields. Such exuberance of spirit, such reckless abandon of mirth, compelling joy would cure a sick preacher on Blue Monday. He dedicated the book to his son, Will Oberlin, a young ornithologist. And Will later studied at Oberlin College and became a student of Lynds's. And in 1920, Clara, his wife, was traveling on the West Coast, and Lynds was writing from Oberlin that Will Dawson has dropped the freshman Bible and come into my bird course. He said nothing to me about it until the deed was done, so I am not guilty. I don't know what his father will say. So Will was indeed following in his father's footsteps and leaving the study of theology for the study of birds. The next Birds of Ohio wasn't published until 1989, so more than 75 years in between. Changing now to recreational birding. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the movie The Big Year. It's one of my favorites. My family always insists that newcomers sit down and watch it before we will welcome them into our family. And this is where I first got started with Lynds, this notion of a big day. So they set out from Oberlin, documented all the bird species they saw or heard in a single day. In 1900, Jones also became the first solo bird watcher to see 100 species in a single day. I still haven't managed this. My family and I do big day every year. We've gotten to 97. We're close. But if you imagine how someone would do that in 1898, they weren't driving around. Um, so here's from Lynes's daily diary. We went to the South Woods at 3:15. I still bird in the South Woods. It's one of my favorite places, and there are owls there. So I presume that's why they went at 3:15, is to find the owls. Stayed till 7:30, came home to breakfast, took 8:30 car, so they got on the train, went to Elyria, changed for Lorraine, and then walked again. So they walked maybe 3 to 4 miles in the South Woods. This is a distance of 4 miles along the beach. And then they walked cross country over farm fields and along a stream back to Oberlin, about another 10 miles. And they recorded 102 species of birds and were home in time to eat a late supper. Now, big days, big weeks, big years are everywhere. By 1903, this had become more widespread, and other people were publishing all days lists in the Wilson Bulletin. Now big days are fundraisers. The biggest week in American birding is happening starting today in Northwest Ohio. And of course, the book and the movie, The Big Year. Christmas bird count, 1897. They called it a winter census. This is again from a screenshot from Lynes's notebook, where he kept a daily diary of the weather, temperature, scarcely a breeze, and it's very taciturn. Dawson and I took the bird census of 2/3 of town within the 3/4 mile limit, 16 species and 74 individuals, about 10,000 English sparrows. I think English sparrows or house sparrows were even more of a problem back then than they are now. This is the 3/4 mile limit. I live right around, it's not, yeah, right here. Again, they published this in the Wilson Bulletin. There could hardly have been more favorable a winter day for taking a census of the birds of Oberlin. Just sharp enough to give zest to outdoor life without discomfort, just bright enough to give activity to the birds. This is my favorite paragraph, favorite sentence in the entire paper. Such little things as high picket and wire fences, thorny hedgerows, inquisitive housekeepers, and threatened incarceration as lunatics are not to be considered. This census taking, if given as much attention as the note taking, which every lover of birds indulges in during the spring, will fill in the usual winter blank with notes second to none in point of interest. He later goes on in this same article to talk about how one ought to do like a winter big day. And he described the trip that he took, which was identical to his big day in May, except he did it when they're in a gale and when there was pancake ice on the lake. And he ended the article with saying, try it for both of these practices. You can imagine why the count took um, was popular and the big day was not. So in the Wilson Bulletin, he suggested everyone should try this. Frank Chapman certainly would have read that. And he proposed a national bird count at Christmas time on December 25th of 1900. And Lynds Jones was one of 27 people who counted that day and sent in their results for publication. And this was dubbed the quote unquote first Christmas bird count, but now you know that it wasn't. In 2024, 83,000 people counted in 2,600 count circles. This is now standardized to 15 miles in diameter, which seems a lot harder to do than 3/4 of a mile, but also you get to include a lot more birds in that. The data is used for guiding conservation efforts. They tallied more than a quarter of the world's bird species. And this Christmas bird count is only in North and South America. It's not in Europe and Africa. So it's the Western Hemisphere. But it goes all the way from far northern Canada to the Drake Passage. They counted 43 million birds this past winter, but that's half as many birds as they tallied 50 years ago when they had half as many count circles and half as many counters. Turning to ecology, I want to bring in another one of his correspondents, Althea Sherman. I don't know if anybody knows her name. She's most famous for documenting the nesting cycle of chimney swifts. She built a tower in her yard in Iowa with windows so that she could look into where the chimney swifts were nesting. And it's a reason why we put up chimney swift towers today. And everything we know about the nesting of chimney swifts started with Althea Sherman. She was a graduate of Oberlin College from 1875. She studied art and was a teacher, but she had to go home into Iowa to take care of her aging parents. And she was kind of stuck in this Ohio or Iowa homestead. And she started observing the birds around her. And she wrote to Lynds quite a bit because he was an ornithology professor at her alma mater. And he encouraged her to publish her articles. They traveled together, or they met up together at ornithology conferences, and she came to visit him in Oberlin in 1906 at Christmas time. By this time, Lynds had gotten his PhD at the University of Chicago and was looking for a permanent job as a professor. And she was afraid that he was going to leave Oberlin and get a better job somewhere else. And in fact, he even sold his house so that he could show the university or the college that he really was willing to leave in an effort to get them to beg him to stay, I guess. And she also very much wanted him to stay and offered to seed an endowment that would ensure continued ornithology at Oberlin. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to raise the money, but she lobbied with the trustees, with the alumni, with even with US representatives. This is a letter that she wrote to him that I discovered in the archives. This was completely unindexed. It was part of the Lynds Jones collection. Oberlin College is very proud of Althea Sherman. They had um, a big display about her in the library, but they didn't know, the archivist did not know that these letters existed until I found them. But so she wrote, I hope the subject connected with the welfare of Oberlin College, in which I have been deeply interested, is being satisfactorily settled. I have tried to do all I can according to the light afforded me. I've urged the matter upon trustees and alumni as I've met them. All agree with me as to what is best for Oberlin, and I think we shall secure her best interest if you can afford to wait. In April, I visited Minnesota. In Northfield, I found all my friends were studying birds. This means that in a few years, our colleges will give more attention to the study, and Oberlin ought not to lose her leading position in the work being done in that line. Unfortunately, Oberlin didn't buy that, but she was able to take the $600 that she had seeded the endowment with and use it to pay him directly. So she paid a third of his salary. He ended up founding his own department of animal ecology after he had a split with the chairman of the zoology department. And it was the only such department in the United States. He was a full professor of animal ecology. And unfortunately, Oberlin College dropped both ornithology and ecology when Jones retired at 65 in 1930. This is one of the papers that Althea published in the Wilson Bulletin. If you can imagine, this is 1910, like women were not publishing in scientific journals. So I think it's quite remarkable that Lyons really encouraged her, and she published under her own name, not a man's name. Um, and this introduction that he wrote is worth reading because he's very encouraging of her studies. And at this time, there was a real kind of shift in the study of biology from the taxonomy of things to studying creatures and plants in their environment and how they related to each other, which is the origins of the study of ecology. But until then, it had been, well, how are these birds related to each other taxonomically? But Lynds Jones really wanted the Wilson Bulletin to be a journal that actually studied or published papers on observations of living birds in their environment. And Althea was one of the pioneers. So she asked Lyons before she did this first as at a ornithological society meeting. She asked him, "I'm not a trained ornithologist. I don't know what people know about northern flickers. Do you think I should even present this paper?" And he was very encouraging. He said, "Nobody knows as much as you know about northern flickers." So he writes, if we properly interpret the particular function of the Wilson Bulletin, this paper accurately typifies it. While there is a certain value to the detection of slight differences in the plumage of our North American birds from museum specimens, and perhaps a necessity for giving names to groups of individuals showing the differences, it remains for the careful student of the living birds to detect the causes for such variations. Of the two fields of study, it must be clear to all that the study of the living bird in its environment is much the more necessary. Our imperfect knowledge makes any system of taxonomy admittedly tentative. If we read this paper aright, we will detect all along between the lines a devotion to the study in hand, which spells an enormous amount of labor. And again, he encourages people to try it. So here she built flicker nest boxes in the side of her barn, and then she visited the nest boxes every day, and she counted the eggs, weighed the chicks, and studied them meticulously. From 1910, Lines began offering summer ecology field trips, initially in Ohio from 1910 to 1914. He took students to a number of sites on Lake Erie. But then in 1915, he decided that he was going to take a trip with students to the West Coast. And so they traveled by train across country and hooked up with Leon Dawson and studied in 1915 the nesting birds on the coast of Washington State. And he required his students to write a paper, and at least one every year kept a photographic journal. And the archivist at Oberlin College put me onto this particular journal from 1915 by Enid Bancroft Sutton. So they traveled to Seattle by train, got on a ship, and sailed up to Nia Bay, where they then embarked on ocean-going canoes with Native American guides and traveled up and down the coast of the west coast of Washington, studying the birds on the islands as they went. One of the things I find remarkable about all of these trips is how many women participated. There's Lynds Jones, but you can see, I don't know that I can ever count as how many, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, maybe 11 women and a handful of men. Here they are departing in their ocean-going canoes. Um, she Her photo albums are just incredible. I've really enjoyed going through it. Here she's got really nice for 1915 photographs of the birds that they were studying. This would have been the kind of camera that she was using, which at the time was like a pocket Kodak. They probably reached into burrows to capture these tufted puffins. They certainly weren't using mist nets or anything. Starting in 1919, after a break for World War I, Lyons decided it would be better to take the field trips by automobile because then they could go wherever they wanted to. And he bought, I believe it was 4 cars, 1919 Model T Fords for the most part, although he experimented with a number of different car manufacturers. Ford was the one that he eventually settled with. They bought new cars in Ohio, drove them to the West Coast, sold the cars, got on the train, and came home. And altogether, he did this for 13 years. Although after every single trip, his son George he said, I will never do that again. And then about February, he would change his mind and say, I really want to do it again. Buy another set of cars and get the students together, and off they would go. And he charged a small fee to cover essentially transportation and food. They camped where they went. This was in 1920. This is his son George, his wife Clara, and they are, sorry, I have to tip my monitor so that I can see what's written. Um, they took a 1-ton truck with them that year, but they decided never to do that again. It was too heavy, it was too slow, and all the touring cars had to wait for it. I just got this photograph from Lyons's great granddaughter, Renata, who said she was going to join this call. Maybe she's on. This was from the 1921 trip. So look what they wrote on the back of the cars. No future, but oh, what a past. Um, that year was notable for Lyons's daughter, Beth, married one of his students, Max de Labenfels, in Tacoma, Washington, which was their final stop on this trip. And Clara made the trip out by train for the wedding. In 1922, I found another journal in the archives by a woman named Grace Cowling, married name Berlin. She participated in the 1922 ecology trip and was one of the first people and one of the first women in Ohio to receive a degree in ecology in 1923. In fact, there were three animal ecology graduates from Oberlin College in 1923. They were all women, and she became an ecologist, ornithologist, and historian. She kept a journal that year, and she was particularly interested in the botany along the way. So she described every single different type of habitat that they drove through. I don't know which way is first, whether they went north and then south, but again, they stopped in Pasadena to visit Lyons' relatives. In Utah, they picked up Lyons' brother Marcus, who was a rather well-renowned botanist of the Western United States. She wrote about 100-page report of this trip and got a B plus. He was a harsh grader, I guess. Of course, with cars come car troubles. Uh, George wrote an account of the 1921 field trip, which I haven't read in its entirety yet, but they would have multiple flat tires a day. The connecting rods would break. There was a weak timing spring in the Fords that they would always break. And George learned how to fix all of these things when he was only in his early 20s. He was like basically the trip mechanic. So here they are running out of gas, flat tire, puncture, and fording a river where there was no ferry or bridge. Here, the whole group of them is replacing a connecting rod. In 1921, the car that Lyons was driving, which was not a Ford, it was called a Dort, which is a manufacturer I'd never heard of. But apparently, the steering mechanism disconnected as he was driving in the mountains, and his car went straight off the side of the road and down a steep hill, was stopped by a boulder. George, who was behind him, only noticed that there was a set of tire tracks going off the side of the road. And he thought, well, that's strange. And he looked down, and there was his dad with his four passengers and stuck on the boulder. And everyone was in pretty good shape, all things considered. The car had to be repaired. They had to send for parts from the West Coast, but that came actually probably more quickly then than it would today. I think they got their extra wheel in about 2 days. Going through these journals and looking at the photographs, I I recognize I've been to both these places, the Badlands and Cedar Breaks, that the photographs of the landscape look pretty much the way we would take them today, except my pictures would be in color, but you would recognize them, these places. But the photographs of the people, of course, are quite different. Um, Here's the group under a Joshua tree. Again, this trip also had a large number of women. Greta, Genevieve, Gladys, Grace, Louise, and of course Lyons and George Jones. They like to have a little bit of fun. I don't recommend opening a pelican's mouth like that. Now, I just want to share a little bit about his personal legacy. His children, Lyons Leo was the oldest. He was not a scientist. He moved to Louisiana and died relatively young age in the same year that his father died in 1951. Theo, the next youngest, unfortunately died at age 13 of a probably what was a brain hemorrhage from a farming accident. This is George. He lived to be over 100 years old, was a botany professor at Oberlin College, and is still remembered quite widely in Oberlin. He died here in 1998, and he used to lead weekly ecology walks throughout town every Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And a lot of people remember that fondly. Beth, as I said, got married on the 1921 field trip to Max de Laubenfels, who was a world-renowned spongiologist, a marine biologist who specialized in sponges. Their son David became a worldwide expert on the taxonomy of conifers. So this fascination with the study of the natural world just like kept running through the family. Harold Charles, the youngest, was a biology professor in Georgia. Let's see, what else can I tell you about the family? Um, I don't know if Renata's on the call, but if she is, I hope she'll introduce herself when I'm done talking. Um, I give a lot of credit to the people who I learned about Lynds Jones from, in particular, Rick Wright wrote a very nice blog post about him in the Biodiversity Heritage blog, and it's probably the most complete information that I could find about Lynds Jones before I started my own research. Mrs. H.J. Taylor wrote a biography of him in the Wilson Bulletin. I dove into the archives very deeply, and I'm grateful to the Oberlin Heritage Center who first encouraged me to give this talk, and to Renata Green, who has been sending me photographs and stories from her grandfather, George. I have a few upcoming talks, and this is a photograph that Renata sent me. Oh, let me go back one. This is Lyons and his 54th Ford car, which was not the last one that he bought. And in fact, this is the last car that he bought, but I don't think it was the 55th. I think it was at least the 56th. George took this photograph, of course, after his father died in 1951. So George held on to this car for a long time. Oh, there was one more thing that I wanted to say about the family. Lynds Jones' son, Lynds Jones, died in the same year, 1951. He was only in his 50s. Lynds Sr. was in his 80s. And then the following year, George's only son, also Lynds Jones, died in a forestry accident at only age 20 when he was a student at Oberlin College. So in one fell swoop in one year, all the Lynds Joneses were gone, and the Jones family name did not carry on. But Renata's son, Lynds Green, changed his last name officially to Jones so that he could graduate from college as Lynds Jones. And
Wow.
with that, that is the end of my talk. Happy to take
Fantastic.
any questions.
Wow. It's amazing that he did Christmas bird count, what, 3 years before it actually was official. Pretty amazing.
Did he know Chapman?
Oh, I'm sure they knew each other. Mhm. Yeah, the ornithology community at that time was not very large.
So the Wilson's Journal of Ornithology, or Bulletin, I think it started, did they name it after the Wilson that all the birds are? Or is
Yes,
that where
yes, Alexander Wilson.
very interesting? Oh, and we got a comment. Thank you so much. Very interesting, and never heard of this man. And
Yeah,
putting together this excellent presentation.
I
And
had
I
never
bet
heard of him
other
either.
Audubon clubs would be very interested. Yeah. I thought it was very interesting. It's funny how they used to collect eggs back in the day too. You know, it's something you never even think of, but it was
Yeah,
one
well,
of the
the 1919 International Migratory Bird Treaty Act put an end to that practice of collecting and selling eggs. So yeah, we never do that today. You have to have a special permit in order to do that.
yeah, which is good
Yeah.
actually, but we have enough things going on for our birds, but yeah. So he owned over 50 cars. I just thought that was amazing that he would buy cars and they were probably worn out by the time you drive them across country.
Well,
So
all the parts were breaking.
it's like, let's come home by train.
The one that he drove off the side of the mountain, um, he couldn't sell that one, and I don't think it was because of the damage. But it just wasn't a very good car, so he had to drive it back to Oberlin.
Oh, I
And I
will
think
have to say,
he took it on the next year's trip also.
oh, he did?
Yeah.
Oh,
Probably
okay.
couldn't afford to buy a nice new car.
I've never heard of a Dort either. D-O-R-T?
Yeah, Dort. I haven't looked it up. I should.
Wonder where that is made. Maybe in Ohio. They used to make some cars in Ohio.
Yeah.
Can't remember the name of them, but
He died in 51 and Renata's 71, you said?
She's
She
she'll be
just missed
70
knowing.
this she'll be 70
She
this
just
summer.
missed knowing him.
Yeah.
very cool.
Anything in the chat? I haven't been looking.
Excellent job, just excellent. Any questions or? So how long did it take you to put together this information?
Oh boy, that's a hard question because I started in 2018 and then I was interrupted by the pandemic actually a couple of times because I initially was scheduled to give my talk in like January 2021 and that didn't happen. And then I was scheduled to do it in 2022 and then I couldn't get into the library again at Oberlin College because there was another wave of COVID. They shut down all the facilities to outsiders, and I kind of gave up for a while at that point. Um, and then I picked it up again in 2023, I guess. So I've been working on it on and off for about 7 years now,
All right.
or
Well,
off
we'll
and
look
on.
forward to the book when it comes out. I
Yeah,
love the pictures too. Those are great pictures.
aren't they amazing?
Oh, I love those old pictures. Why do you think there are so many women birders in Jones' group? Was it just not considered suitable for men to be birders back then?
That is a really interesting question. I have no answer to that. I found that fascinating how many women went on those ecology field trips. But I don't think he treated the women in his own family the same as the students. And that's a family dynamic that I haven't teased out yet. But there's some indications in his letters that he really expected his women to be um, basically his helpmates, even his daughter. He complained to his wife that when Claire was traveling on the West Coast, he complained that Beth never had the dinner ready on time, and didn't she know that he had to get back to teach classes?
Now, there is a question in his bird list. Did you find any species that are
Ooh,
now extinct?
I have not looked that extensively. I certainly have found species that don't nest or don't we don't see anymore. Um, like piping plovers, for example, they're not extinct, but he discovered where they were nesting in Ohio, and they certainly don't nest there anymore. We had a pair of piping plovers nest at Maumee Bay in 2022, and it was like the sensation for the entire state.
I do
That
remember.
went crazy over that.
I think my sister bought a t-shirt.
Yeah, yeah, I have my t-shirt.
Yeah. So, so he was one of the first people who did lists, bird
Yeah,
lists, like we do now. Of course, it's a lot easier with eBird.
yeah. Well, and he encouraged people to publish the lists in the journal. But at some point, it got to be unwieldy to have all those lists because the more people who were collecting data, it just took up a lot of space in the journal. And he reluctantly agreed that it wasn't as scientifically valuable as some of the other things that they were publishing in the journal. But it's kind of funny how that's come back around, and now we have a new way of publishing lists that makes it very accessible to everyone.
Hmm. Very cool. All right. So one of the first bird travel trips also.
Yeah. Do I have a website or contact information that I can put in the chat? I do not have a website. Um, let's see. I can put my email in the chat. If somebody wants to make me a website, I'd be happy to have one. It's just not my forte. I can write, but I can't. I'm not a designer.
Mhm.
Um, web design has gotten way beyond my talents.
Yeah, I will have to say ours, we did not do it. We hired out.
Yeah. I don't have any income from this, so I can't hire out.
That's true. That's true.
Well, we're really glad you have this hobby. Very,
Yeah, it was
very
very
clever, good
interesting.
stuff.
I love hearing about those, the early days and walking 10 miles. Oh,
Yeah,
to
and
do your Christmas bird count or big day, I think it was.
George said that lions walked even more than was usual for people of that time. Oh, something I forgot to say about George. He was a real character. His father founded a journal and published all these scientific papers. George was a scientist who never published a paper in his entire life. He collected botanical samples, but he wrote prodigiously unpublished works. He wrote an 800-page typewritten biography of his father, assembled from these daily diaries that Lines kept. And I have tried to make my way through it, but literally it is like a day by day account. It's not even broken up by chapters by year. And so it has the mundane, like he moved the manure piles with the very interesting things like um, Althea Sherman coming to visit him. And I have to like kind of pick through all the chaff to find the good stuff. But George also wrote a 4,000-page autobiography that I have not been able to bring myself to tackle. If you were to publish that, it would be like 20 volumes of an ordinary length book.
Oh, but I kept him busy.
Yeah. And he saved everything. The material that's in the archives is it's unbelievable.
Hmm,
And Renata has more.
that's cool. All right, very good. Any other questions? And
All
thanks.
right. Well, we'll post
Thanks.
this on YouTube and we'll let you
Yeah,
the link, Diana. And thank you so much.
thank you so much.
Thanks for
Bye,
having me.
everybody.
Good night.